The Philippines, like many nations today, is facing a significant demographic issue, a falling birth rate. To understand why this is happening, we must first look at how the birth rate was much higher in the past and the factors that contributed to that. Let's start with the generation of our great grandparents. This generation relied heavily on having numerous children for practical reasons, namely to have farmhands and ensure social security. Back then, children were viewed as retirement plans, a safety net for old age. With high infant mortality rates, families had more children to offset the loss of those who did not survive infancy. Life was primarily agrarian, with people living in simple huts, using draft animals for work and depending on land to farm. This trend continued with our grandparents, who faced many of the same challenges, but with the added hardship of World War II. Despite these tough conditions, they continued having large families for the same reasons as their parents. Children were needed to help on the farm and to provide for them in their old age. However, changes were on the horizon that would profoundly shift the course of their lives and those of their children. But over time, a strange form of amnesia set in. Many of these elders now recall the religious duty behind having many children. Go forth and multiply, they'd say, with rosary beads in hand, yet they often forget the economic desperation that quietly underpinned their choices. Religion became the story, the justification, even the pride, while the harsher truth, that children were needed for labor and long term security, was allowed to fade into silence. It is easier, perhaps more noble to say God willed it than to say hunger forced it. Entered the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, whose quote from Beyond Good and Evil resonates with this era. That which an age considers evil is usually an unseasonable echo of what was formerly considered good, the atavism of an old ideal. This can be interpreted as a reflection on the outdated ideals of agrarian life, where farming methods remained stagnant and procreation was seen as a necessity for survival. But these old ideals were about to face a brutal reckoning. To illustrate this, let's consider a scene from Goodfellas, where a young Henry Hill narrates his childhood. He describes living in a cramped apartment with many siblings, much like the cramped conditions in rural homes during the 1960s and 80s, where large families were the norm. The difference here is that these children were growing up in a world where many parents were starting to question the system. The trauma of their childhoods, particularly the impact of martial law in the Philippines, would play a major role in shaping the choices of the next generation. For people born in the 1960s to 1980s, particularly their parents, life on the farm was no longer sustainable. The old farming methods passed down through generations were no longer effective. The dream of becoming educated city dwellers and breaking away from the hardships of rural life became a major aspiration. This generation in particular sought to give their children a better life than the one they had. But in trying to break free from the past, they unknowingly created new challenges, most notably a decline in family size. This generation saw their parents' large families as a symbol of hardship. They grew up in crowded, often abusive environments where survival was a constant struggle. As they became more educated and moved to urban areas, they realized that a higher quality of life and fewer children was now a viable option. The norm shifted from having 8 to 12 children to just 3 to 4. They also became convinced that overpopulation was a pressing issue, largely due to the poor living conditions they witnessed growing up on the farm. The fear of overpopulation led to a decline in birth rates, as families began to focus on quality of life rather than quantity. And then there was the impact of Ferdinand Marcos Sr. Martial law cast a long shadow over this generation with its political repression and economic challenges. The trauma of that era further reinforced the desire for stability and escape from rural poverty. This led to smaller families and an emphasis on individual aspirations. Now, where do we find ourselves in a situation where the birth rate is falling in the Philippines? The same generation that sought to give their children a better life is now facing the unintended consequences of their choices. The question remains, can we really blame them for wanting better for us? The answer is complex. Ultimately, their efforts to improve their lives and escape the hardships of their past have created new challenges for the future. TLDR, the decreasing birth rate in the Philippines is a result of generational trauma, stagnant and outdated farming methods, and the political turmoil of martial law. These factors, along with a desire for a better life, have led to a significant shift in family size and structure. While these changes were driven by a desire for progress, they've also created new challenges for the nation's future.